All right. Well, everyone, welcome to our next workshop on um, identity and inclusion. Our presenter today is Nikita Saxon from the Office of Student Cultural and Engagement. So I'm going to turn the time over to him and he can go ahead and get started.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Looking forward to a robust conversation around identity and inclusion. Again, my name is Nikita. I am with Student and Cultural Engagement, and I oversee ASU's Culture at ASU initiative, a university-wide initiative which supports the identity, inclusion, and expression of all Sun Devils. Within our Culture at ASU initiative, we have Sun Devil Civility, which houses all of our educational workshops and engagement opportunities. So today we're going to be practicing and promoting inclusion for ourselves and others. Today's workshop goals are going to be to understand what creates identity and how personal and social identities are developed, and then relate identity to broader concepts around unconscious bias and inclusion. And so again, small group today. So if you are wanting to speak, wanting to make sure that we're not speaking over anyone, but so go ahead and use the chat to indicate that you would like to speak. But the goal for this is, as much as I'm talking, we're all going to be talking, as we all have different identities and different ways that we belong to community. And so for the sake of this conversation, and hopefully this is something that you can take with you as you are continuing to support students in your work, is that this is going to be a brave space in contrast to a safe space. So we want all spaces to be safe, but oftentimes safe spaces can become silent spaces because we believe that within safe spaces, we're not supposed to have conflict or disagreements or any discomfort or any differing ideas or opinions. Whereas the notion of brave spaces is a conversation around yes, we are going to be safe above all else, but we may not always agree with each other, or there may be differing opinions or ideas, and that's okay. Any questions around brave spaces or safe spaces? All right. And in order to create brave spaces, we want to establish some shared agreements. So I'll give everyone a moment to take a look at these shared agreements, and I'll kind of highlight a few of them that resonate with me. All right. So some of these that I really like is understanding that there are different perspectives, and with each different perspective, there are going to be different trains of thought. So it is okay that we don't always agree. But when we are sharing, it is important to always use I statements. So I feel, or in my own experience. So we're really able to take ownership of our own perspective. I always enjoy sharing confidentiality. As I work with students and others, I always like to say that our Sun Devil Civility workshops are like Vegas. What happens here stays here. So we will make sure, as people are sharing personal information or things that may put them in a vulnerable place, that we are sharing things in confidentiality, where we may be able to share some of the learning that we're experiencing, but we don't necessarily need to share who has shared that information or any other identifying characteristics. Above all else, let's just all agree to actively listen and engage with the workshop and others, whether you express that outwardly or quietly. Are there any agreements that you feel are missing from this list, or are ones that you would like to point out, or things that you do with your own students that may be helpful for this conversation? All right. Well, this is a quiet group, but that's okay. We're going to start talking in just a little while. So with ASU's charter, why might conversations around identity and inclusion be important? So feel free to turn your mic on and hop on camera and share, or type in your responses in the chat.
I'll jump in, Nikita. I think the idea of inclusion is really good because one thing I tell my students a lot is I am not the originator and creator of all ideas. Um, I'm not that endless well of all knowing everything. Um, but I think that as a culmination of all of us together, we can accomplish a lot more than we can do on our own. And a lot of times that comes with different experiences and different backgrounds and accomplish something far greater than we could have ever done on our own.
I like that. Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.
I can get two more people to share maybe what resonates with them about the charter or why some of these conversations may be important for us to have.
Anine, my name is Laura Medina. Can you all
Hi, Laura.
hear me? Hi, all right, cool. I primarily work with the Indigenous community on campus, and I think when I hear the idea and the politics that surrounds inclusion, I mean, I think we've seen it from all perspectives. I feel like our communities have always been inclusive since the coming of settler colonialism back in 1492. So with inclusion, I feel like we've always done that, and in fact, in some ways, has even hurt our communities as far as genocide, forced assimilation, colonization. But now seeing how a very much settler colonialist society wants to be inclusive and having an institution include that in the charter, for me, I always just want to tell people it's important to always include the most marginalized, to center the most marginalized voices in the room, and that is often Indigenous people who are marginalized of the marginalized, especially our Black and Indigenous people of color. So thank you for letting me share my watch.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate your comments. And if we get one more on maybe how, what stands out to them about the charter, our thoughts on ASU's charter and how it relates to identity and inclusion, which are today's topics.
If I may speak, I'm Gene Durbeck. I'm a campus minister, and I work with grad students. I think somehow, or sometimes, and being in the minority culture, a majority culture, I think this is something I pick up from some people in that culture, is that diversity is like enrichment, rather than a basis for this public value and the idea of our communities being whole in their inclusion.
Thank you so much, Gene. I like that diversity should be the base. And what draws me to ASU's charter is, of course, the highlighted, we're not measured by whom we exclude, but whom we include and how they succeed, which, our charter is the definition of who ASU, who we are, who we're striving to be, the very best of us. And that diversity and that inclusion is, smack dab the first section of this, and that really resonates with me. I'll say the other part of the charter that, as I've continued to have conversations like this, is the last part, like assuming fundamental responsibility for the economic, social, cultural, and overall health of the communities it serves. It's not enough that we are inclusive and we're making sure that those that we include are able to succeed, but our greater commitment to like the entire community, making sure that everyone is able to see the value in diversity. and see that everyone see the value in inclusion and the strength that our community has, and how that impacts all of those things, the economic, social, and cultural health of our communities is really, that's what resonates with me about the charter. And so we start all of our workshops with this, and this is, again, if this is who, this is the document that says who we are as Sun Devils, and this is what we are striving for in all the work that we do. Thank you so much. So with the charter, we understand that because we are striving, and that is where we hope to be, we understand that we are going to come into contact with Sun Devils in a variety of different places. And so this is the TAR Continuum model of engagement. And so we have tolerance, acceptance, respect, and advocacy. And so ultimately, we know that, again, we're going to meet Sun Devils at any point, but we are hoping for forward progression to advocacy, where we are able to not only accept the diversity, respect the diversity, and advocate for diversity and for the inclusion of all. So again, as you think about the TAR Continuum, this is a concept that can be applied to virtually anything. And so I will give a example. So I think at the beginning, towards the end of last year, maybe November, December, remember getting some emails that Zoom was going to be, an account that everyone at ASU was going to have. And I remember in January, as we have lots of meetings in my department, I've always used our conference lines. But then the conference lines went away. So then I had to tolerate using Zoom. And I'm like, I don't understand this. I don't want to use Zoom. I really didn't, it wasn't something that I chose to do. And because we were still in person at the time, using Zoom really wasn't too much of a, something that I had to do. But I was tolerant that Zoom was there. From there, once we got the word that we were all working remotely and having to teach students how to use Zoom as well as other colleagues, like I began to then accept that Zoom was here to stay, and that it would be in my best interest to figure out how to see the benefits and really learn all of the components of Zoom. Ultimately, throughout the summer, I began to really respect and be thankful that we were still able to work with our students, still able to make connections, and I really was able to respect all of the features that Zoom was able to have, as far as webinars and meetings and breakout rooms and those kind of things. And ultimately, I've now moved into advocacy, where if my family, if we're all across the country, if we try to get together, the best way to get together now is on Zoom. And so now I'm able to advocate for Zoom and talk about the benefits of Zoom and how it's able to connect us all, just as it is today. So again, a very lighthearted example, but again, the TAR Continuum model can be used for virtually anything. And again, we hope that everyone, based on our charter, would be moving towards advocacy around all topics. Any questions or thoughts around the TAR Continuum? All right. So identity. Who can define what identity is in your own words? Feel free to turn your camera on, hop on the microphone, and share what your definition of identity is. I know somebody has a definition. We're just looking for one.
Well, I'll go. Hi, I'm Kyle Frey, advisor for HC. I'm also an academic advisor in communications. In terms of identity, those are just those little things that make us, who we are. I identify as a human first, and then you can break it into all the little subcategories thereafter. But they're those little pieces that make us who we are.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kyle. Those little pieces that make us who we are. Anyone else have any comments they'd like to add?
This is Lori. It's the connections you feel with a culture, the connections you feel with those around you, and how they resonate with who you are.
the connections we feel to cultures and groups and how it resonates. Certainly. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Let's do one more. All right. So identity is, again, it has this double sense. It refers to, at the same time, lots of those social categories, but also the sources of an individual's self-respect and dignity. So if we think about identity, it can be those cultural groups that we belong to, but also there are some innermost parts and aspects of us that also define our identity. So again, what distinguishes a personal identity from a social identity? Maybe to answer that question, we first need to define what would be a social identity as opposed to what's a personal identity.
I guess I give my thoughts.
Mhm.
I mean, just looking at the phrase itself, it's, if I interpret it that way, it's who we are inwardly versus who we are outwardly. Because a lot of times it's not always one and the same.
Absolutely. How we relate to ourselves without any other factors, as opposed to how we relate to a group, because those group identities and those social identities also play a role with who we are. Other thoughts around identity, personal or social? All right, so we'll move on. These are some identities we've asked some students around, and so as you can see that there are quite a few different examples. So we have ASU students, we have political party affiliation, we have family members, those social identities there. I see boyfriend, I see indigenous, I see commuter student, I see gay, I see non-residential, a gamer, a Californian, a fraternity member. We see bisexual, Black, recovering alcoholic, pansexual, sister, autistic. So lots of different categories and ways that we can identify ourselves. So we'll dive into an activity around identity. What is one identity that is important to you? If I can get everyone to share in the chat, what is one identity that is very important to you? Let's see what the responses are. Okay. So Sean says father. Lori is a child of deaf adults. A daughter, we see wife, we see matriarch, we see father. So all of these are very near and dear to us, and they shape our perspective and how we see the world. Certainly. Thank you so much, everyone. And the next one, what is a misconception that people have about this identity? Sean, that you play babysitter? I hear that a lot from fathers. Let's see, a few more misconceptions that people may have about this identity. Inferior, that there's no life outside the home. All right. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of these as well. That's the only thing that defines you. When people think that see some of these identities, they think that this is the only definition that you hold. Or in Lori's case, that you may have had a sad childhood. Certainly, thank you all for sharing and being vulnerable. So a lot of those misconceptions that fatherhood has to be biological. Absolutely, thank you, Christopher. So a lot of these misconceptions come in the form of unconscious bias. And so when we think about unconscious bias is the social stereotypes about certain groups that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. So a lot of the times, as many of the things that you've all shared, lots of those misconceptions may be unbiased, unconscious bias, and people are not even aware that they hold certain stereotypes or beliefs around identity. So we'll dive into an unconscious bias activity. How do we unconsciously divide and categorize others? If we can give some examples of that. So we do it in gender. We see age, certainly, race. And so a lot of these things, gender, age, race, many have bias attached to them that are outside of our conscious. Socioeconomic status, certainly. And so the next is, where does unconscious bias come from? So how do we adopt these biases that are so ingrained in us that we're not even aware that they exist? So Jean says our upbringing, media, past experiences, certainly. And the next question is, how does unconscious bias impact different people or groups? Unfair conclusions about others, certainly. Limits how people see them. Harmful treatment. And I think we're seeing a lot of, lots of these things can exist and are currently existing in our world today. Watching news and getting some alerts. The Louisville police have made some decisions around Breonna Taylor. A lot of people's unconscious bias may believe that, again, there are unfair conclusions, or that certain groups of people are more deserving of harmful treatment in that way. So the next question is, how do we reduce our unconscious bias? What are some strategies that we can use? Talking to people, being aware of it, absolutely. Building community. And so we reduce our unconscious bias by all of those things, and certainly by one, understanding that we have bias, and taking ownership of that is the first step. And that oftentimes, even when we're doing our best, we still may fall, we still may slip up, but the goal is that we continue that forward progression. Stephanie says, going into interactions with an open mind, engaging with others, and asking questions. Also, as you think about past it, we talked about where does unconscious bias form. So we said, our background, our upbringing, the media, our past experiences. Even thinking about those things from a new perspective can also help us, one, understand our unconscious bias, and then developing a plan to address it, or to actively distance ourselves from those biased thoughts. So next we're going to move into a little bit more into our salient identity. Can anyone provide a definition of what they believe our salient identity is? All right. So, well, before we go there, can anyone give me a definition? We need one definition before we can move on to the next slide.
Most apparent. The most noticeable.
So most noticeable, absolutely. So that salient identity is going to be our leading identity. We all hold so many different identities and membership to different groups, but our salient identity is that situational, but that's certainly going to be the one that that we see ourselves in the most. And so here are some identity signs as we can think about some of those things. So I want you to think about this. The part of your identity that you are most aware of on a daily basis is, out of these, let's drop in the chat the ones that we're most aware of on a daily basis. So Sean says religion. Stephanie says at work, being an academic advisor. Race and ethnicity. Size, gender. Awesome. Great examples here. And so the next is, what is the part of the identity, your identity, that you are least aware of on a daily basis? Privilege. Sexual orientation, education, career aspiration. Socioeconomic status, sexual orientation. So again, when we think of these, if these are the identities that we are least aware of on a daily basis, many times, not always, but many times, this is going to be where we have the most privilege. And so as we think about identity and inclusion, like, and moving towards advocacy, how in ways can we advocate for others in support of inclusion? So the next one, which is a great question, the part of my identity that was most emphasized or important in my family when I was growing up was religion. As I growing up, for me, religion was super important. We spent lots of time at church, and even, you know, the community that I felt that I belonged to the most had to do with those who also attended my church. Being smart, sports, religion, education, upholding gender roles, cultural, education. So great examples there as well. Being hardworking, Rebecca says all of the above. And so the part of my identity that I wish I knew more about. Educational, spirituality, religion. So as we think about these, again, these are opportunities to really dive deep and do some more exploration on these parts of our identity as well. And also, as we're thinking about these conversations, let's also be mindful of how we have these conversations, or how we support our students as they are in very critical points in their life, as they are identifying or finding new ways to identify and doing more exploration than maybe they've ever done in the past. Okay, and I think this is the last one. The part of my identity that provides the most opportunity is race. You see educational, education, race and gender, career. Great self-awareness here. Intellect, music, being a curious lifelong learner. Thank you, Stephanie. And again, these are some of those identity signs that we discussed. So what does it mean to be inclusive? So as we think about our roles as advisors, how do we support our students in being more inclusive minded and what does it mean? How do we foster that understanding or that priority with our students? If anyone has best practices or things that they've shared in the past, I'd love for you to turn your camera on and turn your mic on and share with us. So thinking of more ways to remove barriers to the group. Like that, I think oftentimes students may not even realize some of the barriers that exist. And so being sure that they are aware that they may be creating barriers, or there may be some barriers that they've inherited. And how do we remove those? Stephanie says, making space for students to be their authentic selves. I think that's where brave spaces come in, right? Making sure that we're all operating off the same agreements, but we also feel safe in being able to support ourselves as well. Let's see, making sure everyone has a seat at the table and has a chance to be heard, whether in public or private meetings. That is that advocacy that ultimately, like, we want our students to be able to see that, you know, if there are perspectives that aren't sitting at the table, how do we invite them to the table? But how do we also create those shared agreements that create an atmosphere where every perspective is valued and others feel safe enough and brave enough to share? I love that. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Helping to identify unconscious bias, certainly. I think this is unconscious bias, and working on that is something that we first have to be honest with ourselves about, but also I think that when we're having to work through some of that unconscious bias, it's great to have a safe space to do that, or a trusted partner, colleague or companion or a friend who you are able to process some of these things with. Asking questions about what the other person thinks. Oftentimes we'll be in meetings, or as our students, we have some students who may be a little more vocal, so they may occupy more of the talking time. And so how do we pull in others to make sure that those, not only they feel included, but how do their perspectives, how do we create space for their perspectives as well? Great examples here. Thank you so much, everyone. And so again, as we think about, you know, conversations that we're having, our educational opportunities, the goal is that we create an action plan, because we know that as we are all committed to be lifelong learners, and we are hoping to foster that the same spirit or understanding with our students, action plans are a great way to ensure that we are constantly checking in with ourselves, and we are striving towards our goals appropriately. So the question is, what will you do to support your own growth in identity and inclusion? So as you all may be brainstorming those, we've compiled a couple questions, a couple ideas for you all, so see, listen more, talk less, asking questions, continue to trainings and workshops on diversity and inclusion, make sure I'm using the right language and learning new approaches. So again, asking questions, being bold and speaking up, empowering and encouraging others, being mindful of how our actions may be affecting others, thinking and acting with dignity and respect, more learning, more Sun Devil civility workshops, and above all else, just do something. Sometimes we think that the task in front of us is so large that we don't want to start it at all. The most important part is that we do something, and we're encouraging our students to do the same. And so I want to acknowledge Jean, who says, educating myself, looking for opportunities to learn of others' views and experiences, certainly. So as we think about more Sun Devil civility, well, Sun Devil civility is a student-led initiative. So we are available to, our student facilitators are available to present to your student groups. We'll come to meetings, or we can set up special meetings. So these are the topics that our students facilitate. All of our student-facing workshops are student-led. So we certainly value that peer-to-peer interaction and engagement. whereas I take on all of the advisor workshops. So I'm more than happy to continue to have workshops with you all, but want you all to consider would some of these topics be relevant for your students to participate in as well. So we have our website here, Sun Devil Civility. You can also email culture or email myself, nikita.saxon@asu.edu if you'd like to schedule a workshop, or I can make recommendations based on what you define as your students' needs. Lastly, connect with us. We do lots of posting on social media. So Culture at ASU is on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, while our Sun Devil Civility initiatives are on Instagram and Facebook. So that is a great way to stay connected and learn a little bit more about what we are doing and the things that we have going on. And so I am going to hang out for questions, or if you all have any discussion that you'd like to have. But if not, I want to thank you all for attending and thank you for your participation today.
Stephanie, Kyle, do you guys have any questions?
No, I'm all good. Thank you, everybody.
Of course.
This was great. Thank you. I was just making some notes, which is why I hadn't left the meeting yet. Will this be made available later if we want to get a copy or to share it with somebody else in our unit?
Yes, I'm about to stop the recording, so we have it available to share.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Of course.